Okay, welcome back. We're on page 340 or so, talking about attack deterrence. And so, should you be able to tell people, yes, I have a burglar alarm, yes, I have an ID? Sure. What brand, what model? No, but let them know that you've got a system that might by itself just go, well, okay, I'll go someplace else. And there's some other things that the IDs can do. Quality assurance and continuous improvement, like a scorecard on your system. You could say, well, we've been tweaking this thing and modifying this thing as it goes along, and we've been able to successfully, defend against this, and that, and the other. Monitoring activity that indicate an inside theft. That's a little bit more complicated, because people on the inside typically have an awful lot of privileges, and so we are detecting not just from the outside, but so it's not really an intrusion detection system. It's a problem detection system, so to speak. So the things going out, meaning somebody's leaking, proprietary information, that kind of stuff. So this thing that they call it a kill chain. All right. So this basically is how this thing works. So first, I make a reconnaissance run. It could be something just doing Google searches about your company. It could be physically being on site and like running a network mapping tool or any other type of software. And then I weaponize the data that I have. For example, I find out during my reconnaissance run that, okay, you have a server that hasn't been patched. So I weaponize that idea. I go find the vulnerability that's specifically been mentioned, and then I deliver the component, I exploit the thing, I install software, and then do whatever, like command and control or whatever I'm supposed to do. Now, what you would do is you would detect someone doing reconnaissance, deny them for doing weapons, disrupt the delivery, degrade the exploitation, deceive them, and destroy. So this is all how it kind of works. Okay. So that's the kill chain. So types of IDs. So general categories, basically two types of these guys. Here's one where I have an untrusted and have out the router kind of thing. And then I have some sort of intrusion detection. And I'm looking at packet flow, right? I'm determining the packets and alert administrators if there's some unusual patterns. So network-based, okay? So this is all network-based. Things coming in, I check to see what's going on. The other is what's called host-based, where I actually put a piece of software on the machine and have it checked. So for example, network would be great for, somebody doing, denial of service or something like that. But if I want to check to see if somebody's poking around the Windows registry, it wouldn't be a network IDS that I need. I want a host-based IDS, okay? All right, so let's talk about the network-based ones a little bit more. Typically this is kind of sort of the way it looks. I have an internet and a router and a switch and the firewall, and then some sort of other switch, and I go to my internal. So it's sitting sandwiched in the DMZ, essentially, on the firewall. And so I have a IDS, and they call them sensors. A sensor could be a physical device, but most likely it's not. Most likely it's just a piece of software, okay? And it probably runs on the firewall. That's what the whole next generation and the super duper firewall companies sell you all this stuff with intrusion detection stuff built in. It's typically not a separate box as it is here, but that's okay. This is a good thing. And then I have a management system and a console that runs, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All right. So designed to scan the network, it could include what they call agents or sensors. That's typically pieces of software, or it could be hardware. So a passive sensor would be one that just sits here and says, well, I'm coming in here and I've got my my IDS sensor and I'm just sending stuff down, or down here I'm scanning and I'm sending it to this management switch. So all these guys are on a separate little network off to the side. Okay. So it's true that modern network devices typically have what's called a monitoring port. You guys remember how these things work? Switches. In the old days, you had a switch and a hub. Those aren't terms you need to know. But just the hub was any data coming in on one port was automatically sent to all the rest of the ports. A switch, if it wasn't destined for you, it didn't get sent there. So data coming in on one port only came out of one port, not everybody, except for what's called a management port. And the management port basically says, I want to see everything. So it's sort of like a conglomeration of all of the traffic on the entire switch gets run through that. So that's where you would connect this guy up. Okay. Anyway, and so it's called monitoring, mirror or switch analysis, span, switch port analysis. Okay. And then, so what can they do here? Well, they could do protocol stack verification to make sure that all the packets coming in are well-formed packet. There's no fragments being thrown about. Application level stuff. I could say, for example, whoa, we don't do FTP inside our network at all. We don't have any incoming FTP, none, zero, zip. And in fact, we only have 2 people in the entire organization that are allowed to do FTP out. That kind of stuff. So it could find, high-level protocols like, HTTP, et cetera, et cetera. And this could include something as simple as excessive traffic. I know I'm going to be getting some HTTP traffic. Yeah, okay. But this guy could look at it and go, this ain't normal. Okay, you're getting way, way, way too much. Connect, disconnect, connect, disconnect, connect, this and over and over and over and over to the website. Something's up. Doesn't even have to know what, right? It's just the frequency is out of range. Okay, so the pros and cons. So passive devices typically have very little impact. I mean, they basically let things go through and just listen. Right? They're not interrupting, right? They're not going in and saying, no, you can't have that. They're just listening. That's all they're doing. So they let things go and listen. Okay, good. So it's invisible, so there's no real way that they can attack. They really can't tell because there's no way you can look at it. And they can be overwhelmed. If you send way too much stuff, listening ports could get messed up. And here's the real key to it. I hope you guys are paying attention. So we talked about network-based, right? So imagine I have an encrypted HTTPS connection to a web server. So my PC over here is connecting to your web server over here, and it's end-to-end encryption. Okay? So anyone listening in, like here in the passive scenario we're talking about, they can see the packet, but they can't see what's inside of it, because it would be no different than somebody in the internet intercepting a traffic and trying to see it. It's end-to-end encryption. So network-based cannot see inside the web traffic. So that's kind of a disadvantage. Okay, so wireless scenario, okay, sometimes it's built into the wireless access points, not at your house, but when you go to buy wireless access points for like the university, they could have their own IDs built in, or they could just have them separately. There's fewer protocols to deal with. Everything is running across, the normal kind of stuff. And here's the thing. Most of these, wireless IDs, or wireless access points for that matter, they're probably not often put in secure areas. For example, it's very common at the university. We have long, hallways, right? And so it makes sense to put the wireless access points in the hallway, right? Not behind a closed door with a lock, but just exposed, right? So the IDs and the wireless access points are just, out there that anyone could look at and go, Okay, so the sensor range is probably going to be about the same as the access point, right? Kind of makes sense. And detect the use of wireless scanners. If somebody's doing a scan, a drive-by kind of a thing, and they're scanning for wireless, you could easily detect that. And you can detect, rogue access points. If somebody plugged in an access point to a hardwire scenario and to bring up their own wireless, like in the classroom, you go into the classroom, you jack into the hardwired port and fire up your own. Okay, it could say, whoa, that's not one of mine. Okay. And so network behavior analysis, okay, this basically is just like the firewall. It's like, got source and destination, that kind of stuff. keeps a log of all this stuff, the number of packets, start and stop times for the sessions and things of that nature. So practically everything could be recorded down here except for the contents of the packet. But that's okay, because I can tell the frequency, I can tell where it's coming from, what time zone, what country, all sorts of good information, and the frequency of the data coming in or going out, and therefore I can tell what's normal and what's not. So I can detect, denial of service. I can detect scanning. I can detect, unexpected services like, whoa, we don't do FTP. Or policy violations. Typically, we're talking about on the inside. If I say you can't use streaming services from the corporate inside the corporate land, and so you do it anyway, well then, yeah, the network behavior guy could look at that and go, I see somebody in your organization that's doing streaming. Okay, so host-based, so page 348, basically the same concept, except instead of listening to a flood of traffic, we're listening to just the things that are going on inside the server. Now, if I have the IDPS software installed on the server, like the web server, I can now see the contents of the encrypted package because it's on the server, okay? Couldn't do that at the network part. All right. So again, it's almost always a not. I mean, the host space implies it's not a separate device, right? So it's a piece of software installed on a server or a PC. So detects when somebody is, creates or modifies or deletes or, auditing logs. If I have it set up so when anyone creates a brand new local account, so most of the time servers don't use local accounts hardly for anything. But if somebody created a local account, I go, whoa, something's going on. Configuration files, INI files and things of that nature. Somebody's poking around the registry. Yeah. Modifying keys, adding keys, changing things. Now, you would expect this to have some very emphatic, false positives. For example, every time I install software, I'm going to get registry keys. I'm going to get file, I'm going to get directory access. I'm going to be creating files and folders. I'm going to be tweaking the registry, tweaking configuration files. So yes, it's going to detect all this, right? But somebody has to say, wait a minute, that was Bob yesterday when he was installing the new version of SQL Server or whatever. Okay. So we have this really cool thing that we do in the virus class, the 4348, where we have the thing called regmod or procmod or we set it up and you listen to the things happening to the machine. You get to see every single file activity, every registry activity, all that stuff. So anytime somebody pokes around like those C Windows or the Windows System 32, I'd go, ooh, what the heck are they doing? It could be just, a reconnaissance run. Somebody poking around, program files. Yeah. Okay. So pros and cons. It can detect local things. Here's a crazy scenario. So I walk up to the server. I'm not supposed to do this. And so I sit down at the server and log in as administrator on the server, and I'm tweaking the registry, okay? There's no network protocol, network IDPS in the world that can detect that, right? Because it's not going through the network at all. I'm just sitting at the chair. So this guy can detect an awful lot of things that are not network related. Okay, good. I can detect local things. I can see inside HTTP packets. That's a big one. And it does need to be configured for every host. And it's not necessarily invisible. So it itself could be a target of an attack. And because you're running this, there could be a small performance hit. Everything is going on. Maybe the services are going to be degraded a tiny bit because you have this sophisticated monitoring going on. Okay, once again, we're coming up on the 15-minute mark.